It's my privilege to welcome to this seminar Professor Kathleen Richardson. We have the wonderful title of sex robots, but actually we're talking about relationships, and there are huge implications in technology and AI for relationships in terms of attachment, loneliness, and so on. Kathleen is very well qualified, in fact, to talk about this. I think you're almost a lone champion, are you? I don't know, but she pops up all over the place. I keep seeing her at things, but she's really very able to lead our discussions and to give us the information that we need. She has written extensively. She is Professor of Ethics and Culture of Robots and AI at De Montfort University, Leicester. And I know that we're going to have a stimulating time. So, Kathleen, we really appreciate your giving your time. I know how busy you've been in the run-up to this with writing and travelling and so on, but we're very grateful that you're here.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you.
And it is a real pleasure to be here. I mean, as I said to Nola, that I normally attend robot and AI events from an academic perspective. So to be here, to listen to John and to listen to Nigel this morning and all the contributions has been really interesting for me to have these new perspectives. So I'm very grateful to you in the... Now, I've got a lot of themes to get through because I want to kind of share what's going on. I want to kind of communicate why things are going on and what kind of solutions we're saying we can use as a society or a community to solve problems that we see going on. So I want to talk about artifacts because the conversation this morning was that every artifact is neutral, and therefore a technological artifact can be used for either good or bad. And I want to problematize that right off. I don't think all artifacts are neutral, and actually I think there are some artifacts that we should say no to. But that place of saying no to something is a very controversial step to take in our culture, because immediately when you say no to something, it throws up questions about regulation and banning, and somehow you're interfering with people's creativity and all those kind of things. But I want to make an argument today that actually we should say no to some things, and I hope I can persuade you why we should say no. The second thing I want to talk about is ethics, because we're concerned as a society today that there's not enough ethics. And I'm sure every single person in this room has had probably several ethical dilemmas this morning. Should I go out this evening, or should I stay in with my daughter? Should I, watch that film and eat that pizza, or give to charity? All of us spontaneously have ethical dilemmas. We're constantly thinking, weighing up what is right or wrong, good or bad. But when we think about philosophical ethics, and that's what's really being talked about today when we talk about the ethics of robots and AI, we tend to think that there are some ethics out there, or there is some ethics inside a philosophy department or inside the philosopher's brain, and if we get at those kind of ethics and then use them as a way to make sense of robots and AI, then we'll all be safe. And I want to say you shouldn't accept that story, because it's a very dangerous story. And I'll tell you why. So my background is in anthropology, social anthropology, and I joined an ethics department 4 years ago. And what I've learned in that time is you can make an ethical argument for anything. You can make an ethical argument for nuclear weapons. You can make an ethical argument for prostitution, child abuse. You can make an ethical argument for guns. So actually, ethics in itself is not going to solve our problems. And I hope by the end we get to the talk, we can actually say, well, what kind of ethics is being talked about? What can help us? But we might need to be thinking somewhere else if we want to solve our problems. And I agree with John that politics and civil participation is one of those places that we can have a different kind of conversation. So I'm going to go a bit back in time. So I began my research at the Humanoid Robotics Group at MIT. All my fellow peers were off going to Mongolia to study indigenous people, and I decided to go to the labs at MIT and study the making of robots. And one thing I noticed when I got there was They were making these objects that they claimed would become people's companions. They called them social robots. And what I also learned when I was at MIT is that in order to get into MIT, you have to, well, to do computer science and robotics, one of the things you have to be really good at is working at a computer. So there was this, in terms of applications, the more evidence you could show to the admissions tutor that you worked at a computer alone and you developed programs, the higher your chances of getting into MIT. So there was this idea that artifacts themselves, you know, spending more time with this artifact was the computer, was a way to get into MIT. And then there's also another idea, because we live in a society that's divided in a very sexist way. We have traditionally had men go out into the world and do the work, and women stay at home. I know that's changed a lot now, although every single woman I know actually also primarily looks after her children, their children, the family's children. So I was also entering a space which was very male-dominated, and they were telling me as well that care could be done by a machine. It was something, you didn't need a human being, a machine could do care. And they started to tell me that there are all these problems in society. So there was these senior populations who didn't have anyone to talk to. And their solution wasn't to think about intergenerational kind of relationships and how to build them, or even look at the background about why this isolation issue had come about in the first place, which is due to a breakdown in the state and society and intergenerational relations. They said, no, there's this problem in society, and we're going to create a technology to solve it. We're going to create these robots. So that's kind of how it all began. And I have to say, back then, I didn't know what to make of this. I was like, yeah, okay, well, it's not going to do any harm, right? And surely it's better to give a robot to a person who's got no one in their lives than nothing at all. So I was kind of buying into it. It took me a very long time to develop a critique of what was going on and why it was happening. And it began because I began looking at human relationship and what makes us human. And in order to understand what makes us human, I think the primary thing we have to understand is human beings are not forms of property. Now, you can have a concept of human beings as forms of property. It's called slavery. But if you're an abolitionist like I am, and you do not believe that human beings, their bodies or their relationships should be open to commercial exploitation, then you know, this is an approach that I'm going to share with you today. Now, it wasn't just men building these machines who were saying, you know, these are going to be friends to the elderly. There are also lots of female scientists participating in this. So this is Cynthia Breazeal. And what they were trading on was this idea that women are more emotional. And so you had this strange world. You had this world that was very patriarchal, with men being alienated from caring roles in society, kind of creating these robotic machines. And then you had, alongside them, kind of this female essentialist idea that women were more caring. And together they kind of fused to build these companion robots that we see more and more today. So even though sex robots have been around in fiction for a long time, the problem that I'm going to talk about started in labs like this, with people redefining what it meant to be human, redefining what an object was. So I'm going to go back into ethics, and I'm going to talk about Aristotle. So Aristotle is the famous Greek philosopher who talked about virtue ethics, good character. And Aristotle is still spoken about today. But what was very interesting is Aristotle is that he tried to develop an ethics of good character, while at the same time he justified slavery. And he also believed women were property and children were property. And when I said this to the ethicists in my group, why are you using a philosopher that actually endorsed slavery and created a rationale for it back in the time as someone who can tell us about good character? And they said, oh, no, you can get rid of all that stuff. You can just take the bits that you want and import them into the present. And I want people to think about that, because that is a question I'm grappling with. Is it possible for us, or does our kind of future lie in some past that we pick apart in some way? Or, as I'm kind of more thinking, it's something we have to develop anew together. But what Aristotle said was, he said, tools may be animate as well as inanimate. A slave is a sort of living piece of property. So here is the idea that in slave societies, human beings were just living pieces of property. Animate, inanimate. And in the same book, and it's called The Politics, I recommend everybody go and read it, he also said something very interesting that I think is very relevant today. He talked about asymmetrical relationships. So we're all civil human beings, and we believe when we enter into a civil society together, we have to regard each other as human beings. But in slavery, that wasn't the case, because what he also said, a slave must respond to the master, but a master need not respond to the slave. So what you've set up there is an asymmetrical hierarchy. You've said some people with more power can use those with less and not relate to them as full human beings. Think this not relevant for today? Well, we'll see. So then I began to look at all these iterations. So it began from the labs that we were talking about, these companion robots. And then I started to notice these new arguments for, if you like, replacing human beings with objects. And this came from the sex industry this time, the commercial sex industry, offshoots of the pornography and prostitution trades. And in prostitution, we kind of have this asymmetrical relationship set up. So in normal civil society, men and women, or men and men, or women and women, they enter into relationship through negotiation and civil relations. But actually, what prostitution does is it takes a personal exchange and it transforms it into a commercial one. So the buyer of the body of the prostituted can transact it like he can other products. And I'm afraid to say this is always very difficult, because when you have a conversation about prostitution, you've got to have a conversation about the asymmetry between males and females in our society. Because there are the most prostituted people in the world are women and girls, and the people who buy access to their bodies are mainly men. In fact, statistics say 99%. So when you've got this as the kind of basis for thinking about women, for example, you've got this asymmetrical relationship. You're not regarding a woman as a full human being, but as a tool that you can use, an animate tool. You kind of already set the scene for thinking about creating these new kinds of objects and these new kinds of scenarios between men and their representations of women. So if you believe woman's an artifact, why not create an artifact? And then create it in a way designed only to privilege and cater to your needs, wants, and desires. These are concerning developments. I mean, there are child issues around these dolls as well. And I'm very lucky to say that I've been involved with a senator in the United States, and he developed this act called the Creeper Act, which is about preventing the development of child sex dolls and sex robots. So I think, as there's an MP in the room, we should be thinking about those kind of legislations here. But I don't put the explanation for what's going on in some kind of evil person, if you like, or evil society. I put the responsibility in the kind of economic, social, and political organization that we have in our society. We have a dominant worldview that is egocentric individualism. We have a hierarchy of wealth inequality based around sex and class. And those persist alongside civil politics. Now, I don't think they can coexist. One has to go. And the one I'd like to go is the unequal hierarchy between men and women and between human beings to create a different kind of world that we can live in. And what's very interesting is, talking about Silicon Valley, one of their inspirations is a woman called Ayn Rand, who developed this extreme form of objectivism. And she said, man is an end in himself. So the pure libertarian idea is that there's no obligation between man and anybody else in their world, but they're just an end in themselves, and their own gratification and desires, wants and needs can be met. And I think this is a very problematic idea, because what kind of society are we moving towards? We're moving towards a society where people are spending more time alone with machines, where the future is being set up for us to be alone with our mechanical devices. When I began this research nearly 15 years ago, we all talked about the internet and social networking as a means to connect us. You'd be using a technological device, but at the other end, the receiver on that other end would be a human being. We are now in an age where they're saying you don't need to have another human being on the end of a device. You don't even have to have another human being in your life. We're gonna commercially create you one. So we're being told that human beings, women are interchangeable. We know that women actually in the world, because of prostitution, become interchangeable with property. But it's actually becoming more widespread through technology, that all of us are being told that if we can't meet other human beings, if we can't have relationships, there's a machine waiting for us that can fulfill our ever needs and desires. Now, the problem with that is it's not true. It's a myth that's been created by a company, right, and a marketing agency in order to convince us to buy products. And this is what I think artificial intelligence should be renamed advertising intelligence, because it primarily works on the idea of selling us goods and creating new narratives around those commercial products. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about Aristotle, which is the master's fantasy. So in the book, there's this idea that, you've got these animate tools, the slaves, but wouldn't it be great if you could just animate the inanimate objects? They could have life. Now, people read this passage here as something like, a kind of futuristic scenario that we want to abolish all work so everybody can be masters.